What if freedom isn't the power to choose, but the courage to dissolve? What if all our striving to be free, to shape, to define, to control, is the very thing that keeps us bound? Everywhere we are told, be yourself, choose your destiny, create your meaning. But what if the self we're building is the cage we're living in? For centuries, two great rivers of thought have flowed toward the same ocean, one from the West, one from the East. Existentialism and Sufism. One cries out for freedom, the other whispers for surrender. And between them lies the oldest paradox of the human soul. In the 20th century, after 2 world wars had scorched the earth and shattered every illusion of permanence, human beings found themselves standing amid the rubble of certainty. God seemed silent, as if the heavens themselves had withdrawn. Morality appeared arbitrary, a fragile scaffold collapsing under the weight of history. The old maps of meaning had burned, leaving only ash and shadow. Into this void stepped the existentialists, Sartre, Camus, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, confronting the same terrifying question. If there is no divine design, no ultimate architect of existence, what gives life meaning? For Sartre, existence precedes essence. We arrive in the world as blank slates, naked in our freedom, condemned to forge our own purpose in a universe that offers none. There is no predetermined path, no cosmic script, no higher order waiting to validate our lives. The universe is indifferent, and that indifference is both our burden and our gift. Freedom, he insisted, is absolute. But with such radical freedom comes a crushing weight, an anguish born of the awareness that in every moment, in every choice, we are deciding who we will become and what we will allow ourselves to be. To live freely is to live fully responsible for the self we sculpt from the raw clay of possibility. Freedom sounds like salvation until you feel its weight. To be unbound from God, from fate, from structure, is to face an endless horizon, a void that reflects back the stark truth of our autonomy. And yet, even in the terror of this openness, there is a kind of clarity. The world cannot tell us who we must be. The universe gives no instructions, no moral compass, no consolation. The horizon is ours to navigate, but only with the trembling hands of one who knows the stakes. Camus named this tension the absurd, the collision between our hunger for meaning and the world's profound silence. We long for purpose, for a narrative that justifies our suffering, and yet the cosmos offers none. And so, the only response is rebellion, to live deliberately, to create value in a world that refuses to grant it, to forge meaning in the face of indifference. Heroic though it may be, this rebellion carries with it an echo of loneliness, a quiet ache that the universe itself cannot soothe. Yet even as existentialists wrestle with a godless cosmos, other thinkers remind us of a different horizon. Sufi mystics and theological existentialists alike suggest that freedom and faith are not enemies, but companions. In their vision, the soul's yearning for the eternal is not left unfulfilled. It is invited to turn inward, to confront the self, to navigate the abyss of existence with the hand of the divine guiding the way. Where secular existentialism sees a void, they see a path, one that calls for surrender and reflection, not as a negation of freedom, but as its deepest expression. To align one's will with the eternal, to dissolve the ego in fana and find subsistence in baka, is to discover a freedom far richer than mere autonomy, a liberation that reconciles human finitude with infinite purpose. And so, beneath the heroic defiance of the existentialists' rebellion, a question remains, reverberating like a distant bell. If the meaning we craft is ephemeral, can it ever satisfy a soul that longs for eternity? Or does the true journey lie not in conquering the void, but in recognizing the silent hand that has always been present, waiting to guide us through it? Long before modern philosophy proclaimed God's death, long before existentialists wrestled with a silent universe, Sufism had already stood in the same void and responded not with defiance, but with a radical embrace, love. For the Sufi mystic, the human condition is defined by separation. We were once whole, inseparable from the source of all being, yet we have forgotten our origin. Beneath the endless clutter of desires, identities, and ambitions lies a single, aching wound. the yearning to return, to be reunited with that from which we came. The Sufi path begins not in the mind, not in arguments or proofs, but in the heart. The quiet chamber where the eternal whispers, where the existentialist declares, "I create my essence," the Sufi softly counters, "I remember who I have always been." The self is not a project to be constructed, polished, or defended. It is a veil to be lifted, a shadow to dissolve, revealing the boundless light beneath. Rumi, in his luminous poetry, put it simply yet profoundly, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. Every particle of our being holds the infinite. Every fleeting moment carries the eternal." Freedom, then, is not the triumph of individuality, the claim of sovereignty over a meaningless void. It is the awakening from it, the recognition that what we have sought outwardly, in power, in choice, in ambition, was always dwelling within, waiting to be remembered. The mystic does not look for meaning in the world, because the world itself is meaning incarnate. Every breath, every leaf trembling in the wind, every sorrow that tears the heart, every joy that lifts it, all are threads in the divine tapestry, intricate and inseparable. To surrender is not submission to some distant external will. It is to awaken to what we already are, the infinite clothed in the finite, the eternal shimmering through the fragile, temporal self. And in this surrender, paradoxically, we are free. Free not because we escape the world, but because we no longer cling to it as though it must prove us. Free because the veil has lifted and we remember. The ocean has never left us, and we have never truly been apart from it. The existentialist begins with self-awareness, that stark, trembling moment when I realize I exist, and that I alone must define what that existence means. Sartre called this consciousness nothingness, a yawning openness, an empty canvas that can take any shape, a space both liberating and terrifying. In that awareness, we are at once free and abandoned, thrown into a universe without guidance, where every choice bears the weight of our becoming. But the Sufi begins where existentialism reaches its limit, with the quiet, unsettling realization that even this I, the self that claims to choose, to act, to define, is itself an illusion. Beneath the layers of thought, memory, and desire lies the nafs, the ego self, the central veil in Sufi understanding. It is hungry, insatiable, and relentless, feeding on control, on attachment. On the sense that we are separate and sovereign, it wants to possess, to endure, to define the boundaries of life itself. And as long as we obey it, we are imprisoned in an endless cycle of craving, of asserting, of losing, only to crave again. The existentialist stands at the cliff of meaning, arms outstretched, and shouts into the void, demanding an answer from a universe that offers none. The Sufi, however, closes his eyes and listens deeply to the silence that underlies all appearances. And in that stillness, he discovers something startling. The void is not empty. It is alive, radiant, intimate. It moves beneath the currents of the self, and through it, we may glimpse the infinite that has never left. This is not passivity. It is a rebellion, far more profound than defiance against circumstance or cosmic indifference. It is a rebellion against the tyranny of the self, the subtle domination of the ego that convinces us we are separate, alone, and in control. Die before you die, the Sufis whisper. Not in despair, but in awakening. To surrender the ego, to relinquish the illusion of mastery, is to awaken while still breathing. To experience life unbound by the prison of I and mine. To touch the eternal while still walking in the temporal world. In this paradox, freedom is realized not as the assertion of choice, but as the dissolution of the chooser. And only then does the soul remember. The self that shouted into the void was never separate from the living silence it feared. Al-Hallaj's cry, Ana, al-Haqq, I am the truth, stands among the most audacious declarations in human history. He spoke not from pride, not from the ego's desire to dominate or impress, but from a place of utter dissolution. The I that once claimed existence had vanished. What remained was the living truth moving through a human vessel. For this, he was condemned, accused of blasphemy, and executed. Yet in that death, he revealed a paradox that no court, no law, no mortal authority could contain. The ultimate freedom is not the assertion of self, but the surrender of self. This is the mystical inversion of existentialism, where Sartre proclaims, "Man is nothing but what he makes of himself." The mystic whispers, "Man is nothing, and that nothing is divine." The existentialist confronts the void with arms outstretched, carving meaning from emptiness through choice, through the assertion of will. The mystic, by contrast, falls backward into the void, allowing the self to dissolve into a vastness that is alive, radiant, infinite. The existentialist's freedom is vertical, a climb against indifference, a defiance that creates meaning. The mystic's freedom is horizontal, a surrender that unveils the hidden life beneath all striving. And yet in that surrender, the mystic discovers something astonishing. To lose the self is not annihilation, but communion. To relinquish control is not emptiness, but the realization of fullness. Both reject external authority, both refuse submission to dogma, to the illusion that meaning can be imposed from without, and both confront the raw, unflinching fact of existence with courage. One through creation, one through annihilation, each bearing the burden and gift of absolute freedom. And here lies the paradox that haunts the heart of every seeker. If freedom is discovered in surrender, what becomes of the self that surrenders? Does it vanish into nothingness, leaving only the silent void behind? Or does it awaken to infinity, to a life that is no longer bounded by the fragile ego, but touched by the eternal, the timeless, the whole? In that trembling question, we glimpse the edge of human possibility, the place where fear and ecstasy meet, where death and life are one, and where the finite tastes the infinite. Centuries after Al-Hallaj in the vast, sun-scorched deserts of Sind, Shah Abdul Latif Bhitai sang of the same paradox, the dance between freedom and surrender, between self and the divine. His poetry did not emerge from the quiet of ivory towers or the sterility of doctrine. It arose from the rhythm of wandering hearts. From the steps of nomads, the sighs of lovers, the prayers of saints, and the footsteps of those who roamed the borderlands of the soul. For Bhitai, love was the highest form of knowledge, a knowing that is felt in the marrow, not dissected by reason. It is a knowledge of union, not analysis, seeing with the heart rather than the mind. His heroines wander the wilderness, chasing the beloved, not out of obedience or fear, but in the ecstatic freedom of desire. In their longing, every attachment that is false falls away, every illusion melts, and they are left raw, open, and alive to the real. To yearn, in Bhitai's vision, is to awaken. For the soul cannot touch truth without trembling in its absence, without thirsting for its embrace. In his world, exile is not punishment, but purification. The distance from the beloved, the solitude of the desert, the ache of separation, all are fires that forge the self in truth. Freedom without love becomes mere arrogance, a hollow pride of the ego. Surrender without freedom becomes despair, the collapse of the self into emptiness. But when love intertwines freedom and surrender, it forms a wholeness that transcends duality. The unity of will and grace, of being and nothingness, of the finite touched by the infinite. Bhitai's message echoes the existentialist cry to exist authentically. One must strip away illusion and confront the rawness of life. Yet where Sartre begins with the burden of choice, Bhitai begins with the blaze of love, a fire that burns away all pretension, that transforms longing into liberation, that turns the ache of absence into the fullness of presence. In this way, love becomes both the path and the revelation, the trial and the triumph, the question and the answer. To wander, to yearn, to burn, this is to live in truth. To step into the mystery where self dissolves and the beloved is everywhere. Modern psychology has given new language to ancient truths, calling it flow, or ego dissolution, or presence. But all of these are faint echoes of what the mystics lived. For the Sufi, to lose oneself in remembrance is to dissolve the boundaries of self and other, time and eternity. In that moment, there is no doer, no thinker, no chooser, only the pulse of existence itself, breathing through you. This is what Camus glimpsed in his myth of Sisyphus, the man condemned to push the boulder forever who finds meaning not in escape but in acceptance. To say yes to the absurd, that is the beginning of transcendence. Perhaps surrender is the deeper form of that yes. Both the existentialist and the mystic seek liberation from illusion, but their roads diverge in the landscape of the self. The existentialist says, "I am free because nothing determines me." The Sufi says, "I am free because nothing separates me." For Sartre, the ego is the author. For Rumi, it is the veil. But when both paths reach their end, they meet in silence. In that silence, freedom and surrender cease to be opposites. They become two names for the same realization, that life was never ours to control, only ours to awaken to. Freedom is not choosing endlessly. It is no longer needing to choose at all. In the end, the question is not whether freedom and faith can coexist, but whether the self can coexist with truth. From Sartre's cry of responsibility to Rumi's poetry of union, from Bhitai's longing to the modern heart's quiet ache, the same question keeps returning: what are we when we stop trying to be? Perhaps true freedom is not defiance, but intimacy, a oneness so vast that even choice dissolves. Perhaps the art of surrender is the highest form of creation, not of meaning, but of being. So tell me, when you let go of control, when you stop naming yourself, when you fall silent enough to listen, what remains? Maybe surrender doesn't chain us. Maybe it releases what was never bound.